Yeah, I have to do it this way so that I can see the screen, and this is where I'm reading from. So let me see if I can manage to switch the slides and do all of this. Good. I have a little confession to make in the start. This is what I'm presenting here is very much still taking shape and forming as an idea. So I thought for a conference presentation, it's a perfect subject to get some feedback and comments upon. The main argument that I want to make is that the university is a space where the concept of epistemology and ontology belong. Not only does it belong here, it is vital that it remains there for society to retain its ability for solidarity formation and not to deteriorate into outright violence. To curb this potential, it is precisely the reason of why epistemology is emphasized over ontology. And in this presentation, I'm trying to unpack that. And firstly, I want to tease out some of the tensions between epistemology and ontology as far as I understand them. Secondly, I want to put these tensions into the context of the university. And lastly, I want to raise the level of abstraction again and focus on what these internal to the university's mechanisms have in terms of consequences for the wider society. And then hopefully we can have some questions. So I went to chatbot GPT. And I asked chatbot, can you give me a Larkin-style poem to explain to me what the difference is and what the problem is with conflating epistemology and ontology? And that's the poem that the chatbot spit out. Epistemology and ontology, two paths untold, each leading down a separate road, but often intertwined, they do not belong. Together confusion goes strong. It's hard to know what's truth and what's known when the two are jumbled and combined like stone. We must separate these ideas with care, lest our knowledge become a tangled affair. For epistemology seeks to know the way we grasp the world and what we can say. Ontology, on the other hand, does a deal with the very essence of what is real. So let's keep these two apart and not confuse them with a simple art. For only then can truth and wisdom reign and not be lost in confused refrain. It seems to make sense, but do you think the chatbot understands what it wrote? It took it about 5 seconds to spit that thing out. Do you think if someone copy-pastes these types of statement, do they have a deeper understanding what the meaning of the words and the conflation that occur in that? So if we now go to this lovely gentleman, Roy Bhaskar, I don't think anybody can accuse Roy Bhaskar to not be aware of what epistemology and ontology means, even if you maybe don't agree with his take. But these are difficult concepts, and it's not easy to always distinguish them. The reason of why these are difficult concepts is that they only become relevant once we have disagreement. They're only really relevant once we have acrimonious disagreement. And one of the things that I found surprising is that Roy supposedly claimed that Western philosophy has a preference for epistemology over ontology. And in his estimation, this encumbered problem solution. So what I want to use this session for is to think through why this could have been the case and why it matters that it was this way. So go to the next slide. I want to give you So I will not be departing from one particular epistemology or ontology and proclaim that one is better than the other. I profess that this is something that I'm not as yet that I'm still trying to figure out. And concurrently, it appears to me that it's also a bit of a tribalism thing, of where one affiliates himself with whatever coupling between ontology and epistemology that they have a preference for, and then they proclaim that others like oneself are fantastic, and everyone else that doesn't agree to them, they are wrong. And obviously, I'm simplifying here, but that's roughly the dynamic that I'm observing. I also know that there are standard definitions for epistemology and ontology. Nevertheless, here I want to depart from my own working understanding of how I make sense of these terms. So I understand ontology as the boxes that we parse reality into. And I understand epistemology as the sense, the understanding of how we can know true statements about the world. So what I'm using in these definitions is not someone else, because these two are in tensions. And I can only know what boxed reality is being passed in if I can rely on the categories that I'm using to describe said reality. In other words, if these categories are true, a true representation of the world. Likewise, in order to know if something is true or not, I need to have verification principles to check if this is or is not the case. And this presupposes that the categories I'm using for verification have a predetermined relationship that they can be used for that purpose. So once again, the reason of why I'm using my own definition here is to showcase this tension. Not only to showcase this tension, but also to struggle for the words cognitively to be able to articulate this tension as far as I see it. If I'm just copy-pasting someone else's description of these concepts and their explanation of their tension, what I'm doing is I'm retelling their particular perspective. I'm no different than the chatbot. And I'm not diminishing the type of effort that it takes into wrapping your head around that, but it is this is nothing cognitively compared to internalizing the difference and being able to articulate it for your own terms, on your own references, and actually struggling for the words to articulate it. If I just retell someone else's definition, like I was saying, I'm not better than the chatbot. Arguably, I'm giving someone else's ontology of how they parse the world, and I'm tacitly enforcing their particular epistemology as well. And I don't think that this is unproblematic in the sense, and this matters. May I explain why I think this matters? Here's a quote from Eric Hoffer, the so-called longshoreman philosopher, which is very much a man of my own heart because he struggled all his life for articulation. And I like this quote here. Both iron discipline and blind faith strive to eliminate the pause of hesitation before action. Now, by me showing you this quote, I'm doing something. Ontologically, I draw your attention that there is a time delay between thought and action. And depending on your standpoint, you have different opinions about if this is desirable or if this is undesirable. If you're a man of action or if you're a fence-sitter. If you're impulsive or if you're carefully considerate. Ontologically, we're talking about the same type of behavior, but we're making different inferences if that state is desirable or if that state is not desirable. It's the same dynamic that is being inferred here. So in his book, Farewell to Truth, in the foreword, someone else describes his work of Vatmir, and I love this phrase. If Vatmir does anything, it is an invitation for us to think untimely things. And the reason of why I love that phrasing is, one of the things I always try to do before I quote people is that I like to watch them. I like to watch them if it's available. A video where they talk about the ideas. To put it differently, I like to see, I like to smell, and I like to taste how their minds operate with ideas. I like to see their temperament when they're being challenged, how they blush when they're being praised, and so forth. You may think that these things are cheap and even animalistic, and to some extent, I consciously use these visceral metaphors. I did this deliberately, and the reason being is that I think it is in this contemplative pause between thought and action, this is what distinguishes us from the animals in its most primitive form. Furthermore, if there is indeed something to that, this deliberation pause is one where we humans cycle through our natural instincts and deliberately chose which one is appropriate and which one is not in light of the consequences as far as we can tell. Consequences in the sense that if we're faced with new information, we need this pause in order to come up to a rational and ethical conclusion of what sits right with us. And I don't even refer to in a grand sense of like absolute truth or anything like that. These illusion of knowing how the fabric of existence is constituted. The more complex the problems we are grappling with, the more and longer the pause for deliberation maybe needs to be. Additionally, if we're dealing with problems and issues that are so complex that not one person's mind is alone smart enough to think these issues through, Maybe we need to have a specifically dedicated space where this thinking can happen collectively. My argument here is that the university can be or should be that place. I mean, I have just given you my little diatribe of my thoughts that I have been harboring for a while now. Specifically, if I would have been told them to the person standing next to me in the terminal in Amsterdam when I was waiting for a connecting flight to Gdansk, that person would have thought I'm a weirdo. And with justification. Because in normal everyday life, you simply do not use these concepts. Neither do you talk about them. It is just simply not good etiquette. So let me go back to Roy's statement that an emphasis on epistemology over ontology encompass problem solution. Hopefully by now I've been able to show you that this does not necessarily need to be a bad thing. For some issues, we need a specific time for contemplation, and hence delaying problem solution for figuring out what is and is not true might not necessarily be a bad thing. Whilst this may be the case, this does not explain why there has been this supposed preference for epistemology over ontology. So here I argue that Jacques Derrida is correct when he describes Western philosophy as phallogocentric. What he means by that concept is basically a fancy schmancy way to say that Western philosophy has been a pissing contest. He used this in a digatory fashion, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of intellectual navel-gazing that deserves ridicule and that we can do without. However, similar to inverting your understanding about Bhaskar's quote, I also want to invert your understanding about the state of affairs. For example, if I yell now, "There is a fire," and point to the fire, you don't have to think about what René's ontological category of fire constitutes. You can verify for yourself by me pointing there. In this particular case, there is no real fire. It's only a picture of a fire. So epistemologically, my statement was not corroborated in the real sense, only in the representational sense of an ontological distinction. However, if my statement would now have been correct in the initial expectation, I doubt we would be sitting here as calmly and collectively as we are. No, our limbic systems would be firing up, releasing cortisol in order to trigger our fight and flight responses in order to get us away from danger. In other words, we would be in the border of panicking in actions from what would follow. What we would not be doing in that state of mind, if the statement was true, is we wouldn't be thinking. Here, I will maybe make a controversial claim, namely that we are defenseless against the truth, and hence why religions over the ages have presented themselves as the ultimate word of God, where even questioning would have been considered blasphemies, precisely because of this potential of controlling people's actions. But let me come back to Derrida's phallogocentrism. There is a beauty in this state of affair, and that is the ruthless economy of efficiency in terms of information used to convey an idea. There is a fire of 4 words. It takes me maybe 1 or 2 seconds to utter these statements, to utter these words, and I have perfectly communicated what I wanted to draw your attention to, if that statement would have been true. If we return to the gap between thought and action, if this statement is true, this communication potential from true words to action is nothing short but awe-inspiring in terms of what it can do to individuals and entire cultures. In modern speak, we could say that these memes or ideas have become viral. And so from this perspective, maybe we can see why there should, and I'm now bringing in ethics into the whole equation, of why there should be an emphasis over epistemology ontology. Not because one is more important than the other, not because ontology is not important sphere of knowledge to understand. No, because if something is true and coincides with a particular ontology, it deprives people who are not yet agree a space for thinking, for coming to their own conclusion. And this is the reason of why I think an emphasis on epistemology over ontology is important and has been the bedrock of Western philosophy. So, it is here that we come to trust and solidarity and how Hegel defines evil. He defines evil as a mechanism that destroys trust instead of focusing on the outcome, Ontologically, he focuses on the process. He defines evil as hypocrisy, excessive subjectivism, and the pretense that one particular interpretation of reality is universal. The reason of why Hegel calls this evil, in a practical sense, is when these behaviors occur, they undermine the ability for trust formation, for solidarity and empathy, and we become suspect of each other. It is here where I haven't thought these ideas through to the fullest, because by evoking Hegel, ethics, Christianity in the context of trust, truth, we are now entering the truly metaphysic in the very meaning of the term. We are leaving the physical world behind and entering something that exists beyond the experiential. Here we are bordering on religious warfare, war as a continuation of politics by other means, and the inability to find intellectual consensus about matters of how we conceptually parse reality. Then they escalate into physical violence and get solved on an evolutionary basis. Well, this technically is a solution. Epistemologically, I would chalk this up to a blind evolutionary process and not necessarily the power of human ingenuity. Rationality and culture dialectics. In other words, might potentially does make right, but it unhinges the possibility of solidarity and what makes us human. Maybe our ability to come to some sort of understanding at all, given all the stumbling blocks that there are, is truly marvelous. Maybe the very possibility for solidarity with people who we initially did not agree with is something so marvelous and mystical that we ought to appreciate it to the highest degree. Instead, that our differences run away with us and manifest unintentionally in outright hostility and even boil over in open violence. Last slide before the question, sorry. Maybe the university as an institution is the Erziehungssystem, the educational system of Western society that makes problems complexity reduction possible, in the sense that we can think complex issues and problems through conceptually instead of letting fate or the gods decide in their mysterious ways. Here I can fully admit that I haven't yet completely wrapped my head around the dispute between Luhmann and Habermas. But I do tend to come on the Luhmann side of the equation, that complexity always remains complex, and any sort of complexity reduction, in other words, agreement, is only ever temporary and a precondition for further complexity production in the future. I can fully admit that this level of complexity is beyond my comprehension at the present moment. This is why I'm so grateful for this conference and this place to articulate, because it provides me a space to think this openly, to think this through collectively. It is here where I think I'm coming to the end of straining your potential solidarity with my unstructured but structured stream of consciousness. That through a dialectical space of the university, over time becomes concretized and a simpler message. Here, your feedback and comments allow me to find my own words and provides hints and suggestions of where I maybe have missed something or have been mistaken. So the next time I can restructure my narrative and articulation, that the point that I'm trying to make becomes clearer and easier to understand. Because what follows now is questions.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing. We have wait 11 minutes for discussion.
Woohoo, German, 20 minutes. Do not disagree with any of the statements as you've just put it. But what I would like draw your attention to is that you use the word ontology 3 times. Person over there in McDonald's, they don't know what that means. So you can communicate that to me.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going. There's. Let me finish it. Let me finish the thought. That was the presumption, and I. But basically, where I'm going with that is, I think I understand where you're going with that question, and I'm not disagreeing. but that presupposes that I know what these categories means. And for me to use that as a reflective category and me to explain that to people in that heat of moment, those individuals that are in that discussion, they have to have that appreciation that that is important. And if they are not trained, if they are not sensitized to that these issues matter in terms of coming to an agreement, coming to an understanding of what truth is, then you are simply talking hogwash as far as they're concerned. Because they cannot understand you. For all practical purposes, you are talking a different language. And yes, I agree that the person that is working in McDonald's maybe have like like a degree in philosophy because they haven't yet, and fantastic. But that's a matter of chance, and you can't always rely on these types of chances. So taking into consideration the way that the information is structured and how you're communicating to the audiences that you're engaging with, all of these things matter in order to draw out of why that deep reflection that ontology requires is necessary. Because if that appreciation is not there, that individual basically looks at you and going like, what are you talking about? It's the problem is a lot simpler than you make out to be. And for their consideration, it is simple because they don't appreciate those nuances. If you can you see where I'm going with that? Let's come back to the distinction between the animal and the human. The education process that it took you as an individual to get to a sense of being comfortable with these concepts have been years. It's years of sitting, of reading books, of like internalizing that information, of making sense of it. You have used so much cognitive power in order to simplify that complexity that is being referred to by this term epistemology. And if you are now not accustomed to that type of complexity and are being like overwhelmed by it, you're requiring so much cognitive power that you yourself have spent over years from that individual now in like 10 seconds and in a moment, and even in a like situation of conflict when they want to do something, yeah, then you're telling them no, you can't do that because now we have to talk about this thing which you don't understand and which you find hard to. So it's rude because you're acquiring something of them which hurts their head in a very physical way. And if that is cannot be communicated, that is being perceived as rude. And I don't know, maybe that's coming from the British context here of where I've been confronted with my German rudeness and seeing these types of things. But that is basically the dynamic that I'm observing, that you are not doing that. It's basically simply uncouth to do. It's a social convention that has been established, and it doesn't apply to epistemology and ontology as such. It applies to loads of other things as well. You don't talk about problematic issues in polite company or stuff like that. So there's loads of social codes. Fair enough, absolutely, and good on them, and it's absolutely fantastic that they survived. As far as I'm concerned, that is a miracle. But they weren't building a spaceship, were they? They weren't doing a government election of like 20 million people, and that level of complexity that requires these types of nuances in communication, of ordering like complex human organization of millions of individuals that are interfacing, that have complexities that cannot be appreciated by one particular individual. So what I'm arguing for here is to come back to Ronald's point yesterday of like this whole like provocation of like the universities being challenged, and this whole like standing on the mountaintop and shouting to the masses that, oh, you have, I'm simplifying, but have this misunderstanding, we're living in a post-truth society and you make your own facts type of thing, doesn't work any longer as a like convincing argument. So we need to enter, that's basically what I'm arguing for, into these types of ontological discussions. And in my latest paper, I have this wonderful quote from, I'm just trying to find that, from a guy, an educational guy from the United States. And from memory, it basically says something that if science denies its own depth, it unironically engages into a sort of anti-intellectualism that it otherwise pretends to combat. So it's opening up these challenges of how difficult it is to know what an actual fact is, what goes into these types of consideration, instead of just saying, no, this is post-truth and you're like conspiracy theory, because you're already passing them away by that very framing. I stop here. The point that I maybe should emphasize in the next time I think these things through publicly is really stress this here, that when there's danger, when there is like that force for action. Because if I'm in a bar, if I'm with, like a younger person, and we are relaxed, and we have yeah, we can talk about them, and there's time for the translation, all of that. But when there is this pressure applied, when there's these group pressures, then it becomes really difficult to stand there and say, no, hang on a second, everybody, let's just back and let's not act, let's think before we act. And here, that translation is not neutral, because the way of how you use every single word in that situation of pressure matters. Like I was saying, there is a fire. Forwards, you have only this little like way of how to communicate that. And like I was saying, I'm coming down on the Luhmann side of the equation of the Habermas, Luhmann dispute. And like I was saying, I haven't really wrapped my head around like the full consequences of that. But I don't have a problem with excluding people if those people are violent, destructive, and want conflict. How do you keep those out if you're open for anybody? There is sometimes a need for boundaries, and how that decision is made of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate is a really complex decision that is maybe okay for one group of people in one particular context, but then not for other. So it needs to be an open conversation all of the time, so it doesn't become that what you were referring to, that it become totally exclusionary all of the time.
Okay, so let's keep this as a summary. Thank you, Renat.